really combining our two programs and combining artists and really thinking across different mediums. And that's a really unique thing, and I'm excited about what we're doing and excited about the future of what that holds. So now this is our second presentation. Our first was with our first artist in residence, Yao Wusu, and then our next artist in residence is coming up in March with Edra Soto, who is a Puerto Rican artist. For tonight, I do want to tell you a little bit about ICA San Diego before I pass it on to Shellie to talk about her work. ICA San Diego presents experimental art and learning with a mission to question everything. We acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Kumeyaay peoples, which we pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Kumeyaay nation who have cared for the land on which we are on. We are committed to standing in solidarity by respecting this Kumeyaay land and the Kumeyaay people, including all tribal nations. I'd like to thank our board of directors, some of whom are here tonight. Thank you. Thank you to our board of directors and to our amazing ICA team for making all of this possible tonight. You guys did an amazing job. I mean, this is an amazing professional setup tonight, so thank you so much. A very special thanks to our curatorial team, to Husha Sanders, who is here, who curated Shellie's show at the top of the hill. If you have not seen it, you must go visit, as well as to Roxana Lopez, who helped organize the show. Thank you, Roxana. And then also this exhibition has been made possible through the support of Rancho La Puerta. So thank you so much, Rancho La Puerta. Our organization in general is made possible by ongoing support from the City of San Diego, the Linda Brandes Foundation, Bootkenbach Foundation, and the Som Family Foundation. And thank you to our partner First Republic for their support of institutional programming, including making this evening possible. I want to thank our founding ICA members who make all of our exhibitions and education programs possible, reaching over 50,000 individuals across the county each year, all for free. That deserves a round of applause as well. Free is wonderful. And if you're interested in becoming a member of the ICA, Julia Barch is here. You can raise your hand. I can't see one with these, but Julia Barch is here over there, as well as at the front desk. You can certainly join, and your support helps make all of this possible, so thank you so much. As well, I would like to introduce Shellie. Shellie is a multidisciplinary artist born in Beijing and based in Toronto, Canada. She explores the construction of a multicultural society by investigating tradition, gender, the diaspora, and popular culture. She creates images, objects, and installations in a wide range of media to explore how integration, diversity, and assimilation is manifested in the lived experience. Zhang is interested in how culture is learned and sustained, and how the objects and icons of that culture are remembered and preserved. She has exhibited at venues including Work Jam in Beijing, Asian Art Initiative in Philadelphia, Gallery 44 in Toronto, and she is the recipient of grants such as the Toronto Arts Council Visual Projects Grant, the Ontario Arts Council Visual Artist Creation Grant, and the Canada Council's Project Grant to Visual Artists. And she also received the Toronto Friends for the Visual Arts Artist Award in Toronto. And recent and upcoming projects also include at Mercer Union and Capture Photography Festival Vancouver. She is represented by Patel Brown Gallery in Toronto. So please give a hearty welcome to Shellie Zhang.
Okay, great. Can everybody hear me? Yes, okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out and spending your Friday evening here. I'm really thrilled to see some really familiar faces from folks who I've met during my time in San Diego, and also hopefully to get to know more of you over time. So my name is Shellie Zhang. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the artist currently at ICA North's location with an exhibition called What We Bring and Leave. This is my first time in California, as well as my first time in San Diego. And so I too want to recognize that this is unceded ancestral homelands of the Kumeyaay peoples and give thanks to them for caring for this land that allowed me to be here. I come from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, which is the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Wendat. Just to tell you a little bit more about myself before I dive into my practice, I work in photography, installation, and more recently in public artwork as well. And some common themes you might see in my work are things related to light, a lot of color, despite what I'm wearing tonight, popular culture motifs as well, and things you might find familiar from the language of advertising. And as Andrew sort of so graciously introduced, I'm often quite interested in how these abstract concepts such as multiculturalism, diversity, assimilation are actually manifested in our day-to-day lives. So how do we see that in places that we encounter on the regular basis? And what is that sort of subliminal message that we see when that occurs, for instance? And a lot of my practice is quite influenced by my lived experience. So I was born in Beijing and lived there for the early years of my life, and then moved to Baltimore around the age of 4 and spent the next few years there. After living in Baltimore for a little bit, I went back to Beijing and did some grade school there, and also lived in Suzhou, where those are sort of where my family homes are. And then picked up, we went back to Baltimore, and then eventually we finally moved to Windsor, Ontario in Canada, which is a small city that's largely known for being the Canadian neighbor of Detroit, for instance. And so I tell you this information because it really relates to what we bring and leave, which is based on the concept of when we migrate, when we move to different places, what are the things we forget, what are the things we take with us, and these are both the tangible and physical things that we take, as well as the abstract things like memories and ideas that we bring along as well. This particular show is quite new to me because it's bringing together two bodies of work that were made at very different times in my practice, as well as different pre and post pandemic. I feel like we have to talk in those terms now a little bit, and so I'm quite excited that they're actually shown together for the first time here together, because there is quite a bit of conversation that happens between them. And so the first body of work that you will probably see when you enter into the gallery is a series of 5 photographs that are sort of exhibited here. And these 5 photographs are part of a series called Means of Exchange, which I made in 2019. The objects you see here in this photo are all purchased from Canadian dollar stores. And they're things that might be kind of familiar, they're things that might be kind of abstract when put in a pile like this. And all these things come from one city in China called Yiwu, which is in the Zhejiang province. Yiwu is kind of an interesting city in both China and the world globally. It's what's known as the small commodities capital of the world. So in case any of you have purchased something from a dollar store, which probably most of you, like myself, have, it probably came from Yiwu to a certain degree. It occupies a really interesting role in China, for instance, because it's such a trade capital of the world, and you've got people coming in and out all the time to get things and to make business deals. So for instance, after 9/11, when America stopped a lot of trade with areas of the Middle East, a lot of folks from the Middle East actually came to Yiwu to do a lot of trade. And what happened then is that China actually opened mosques in Yiwu, which is kind of something you don't see around the rest of the country. So it occupies this interesting cultural space as well. I'll show some pictures of Yiwu in a moment. But before that, I want to describe some of these images a little bit, which are loosely based off aisles that you would see in dollar stores. So you've got on the top left, you've got your plastic home decor, plastic flowers, that's kind of familiar. In the middle, you'll have your fluorescent neon children's toys. These would be the aisles where my parents would tell me, if you're good, we'll buy you one thing from this aisle. The photo on the top right might also be kind of familiar in case any of you packed up stuff for the holidays recently. These are your home decor things that you buy, possibly use once during the year and then put back into storage. And then on the bottom left, you have a pile of ribbons and tassels. These are things that, when you buy something that you want to gift someone, you stamp it with one of these, and that means that it's a gift that you can give properly. The bottom right image is possibly one of the more interesting ones, because here is a collection of things that loudly brands itself as Canadian. And oh yeah, this is the Canadian flag in case folks don't recognize it. Things that loudly brand itself as Canada, but are produced by makers overseas in China. And an early kind of inspiration for this piece was I really wanted to unpack this idea of made in China, which is commonly associated with things produced in dollar stores. They're cheaply made. They're not quite meant to last. That's sort of its function. And they're part of this quick economy of production that's often quite wasteful as well. And so with that idea, made in China, how does that concept relate to people, and how does that concept relate to us as consumers as well? So a few years ago, I came across this story of the first Chinese woman who's the first Chinese woman who's ever immigrated to America, and her name is Afang Boy. So she immigrated to New York in 1834, and there's actually quite a few records of her, which is quite unique for someone of her stature during that time. Afang was from the city of Canton, what is now known as Guangzhou, and she was brought over by two American businessmen who were in the business of importing Chinese goods for trade to New York. These two businessmen, who are brothers, were really quite interested in, starting up this economy of Chinese goods in New York. So what they actually did is they toured around with Afang and displayed her with a lot of the furniture and goods that they would import as well. So what you'll see on the right here is an advertisement introducing her, saying, come see her. At this time, of course, it was very new and novel for American settlers to be able to see a Chinese woman. And then on the right of that same pamphlet, you'll actually see an interesting catalog of objects that she'll be just sort of shown with as well. And on the left image, which is probably the most popular lithograph image that you'll see of her, here's this woman who's displayed in this room of goods in this setting that's supposed to be her room. And simultaneously, she's cloaked in this loose-fitting Chinese garment. And her body itself is quite small in that space. She's in the center of this image, but it's just her hands. You can kind of see her feet and then her head. And so here is where the boundaries between person and thing get really kind of complicated. She also kind of set an interesting precedent for how Chinese women bodies were viewed for the next few centuries in that association and how hard that was to break. So this was a story that stuck with me for quite some years, and I'm still quite influenced by it. And then a few years later, I came across these images of Yiwu. So when I mentioned that some of my images are based off dollar store images, you can probably see kind of the parallel here of the things that were produced there. In a way, these images are kind of, funny because they're kind of ridiculous to be surrounded by this maximalist display of somewhat useless things. But you see that same effect where the people in these spaces become camouflaged by them to a degree where they sort of bleed into the objects as well. So after seeing these images, becoming quite interested in the goods being produced in Yiwu, I wanted to take a step back and see how these objects sit when they're not presented with bodies at all, which is what led me to produce Means of Exchange. When you take away the bodily associations with different goods, how does the cultural impact that what they have still resonate or doesn't resonate? What are the markers of something being Chinese or non-Chinese? There was that example I used of the Canadian flag piece, but the Christmas piece is also kind of an interesting one to use as well, because Christmas isn't so much the big annual holiday it is here in China, but the goods are being produced elsewhere and then shipped overseas as well. So again, that dialogue is really quite complicated. And as part of this, I was interested in just making that reflection of consumer and producer known. Often I'll take photographs of still lives. And in a way, I see these still lives almost as portraits, both as the portrait of the people buying these things and the portrait of the people consuming these things, but also the portrait of the portrait of the journey that thing experienced in itself as well. The titles for each of those works were also, I'll go back. The titles for each of these works is also how much it costs to buy them. Keep in mind, this was in 2019 with in Canadian dollars with a 13% sales tax, in case you're sort of mystified by the dollar amounts here. This is the first time I've ever had to preface that here. And who knows, if I continue this body of work later in the future, it'll probably look quite different depending on how much these things cost then. Okay. The display of these that you'll see upstairs is quite different from some of the ones that you see in this photo. So the ICA displays the top one right here. And when this body of work was first commissioned, I got to work with a really great curator. Her name's Suzanne Cart, and she was really adamant about seeing how radical she could take an approach to sustainability in curation and working in a gallery, basically, knowing how much waste gets produced in art exhibitions, art fairs, art projects as well. So when we were deciding what color to paint the walls for this show, the gallery that this was at actually had a really fantastic selection of leftover paint from past projects. You would paint, a wall once and then never use that color again because it's so unique and so hard to use elsewhere. So what we actually did is we took a lot of the leftover paint that was available at the gallery and then color matched them to each piece. And then this practice became really hard to part with in the future. And I've carried it on ever since. And as a result, I think it actually takes on a nice little life of its own. It looks a little bit different depending on whatever host organization hosts the exhibition. And it's a little bit of a nod to the fact that the things and the images are so wasteful, but hopefully in the mounting of the art exhibition and hopefully in the future, there could be more of a nod towards sustainability in some small ways. Okay. The second body of work, which is a little bit more recent upstairs, is called Facades. And Facades was made in 2020 and 2021. It was made during another residency, actually, where I did a residency in Saskatoon, Canada. Does anybody know where that is? Oh, yes. Okay, I see some hands. Okay, great. It's in the prairies in Canada, and it's basically a city in our Midwest, essentially. Saskatoon is a really interesting city because it's much slower than the pace of the big urban cities that I'm used to, where things move so quickly. There's less evidence of change. It's more drastic and quick. And so when I was doing the residency at this gallery, you would see a lot of empty signs and empty storefronts, for instance, kind of a mark of transition. And this gallery was also quite uniquely situated in the city's Chinatown as well, which also made some of those markers a little bit more evident in certain respects. When I saw these sort of empty signs that were either faded, forgotten, or just left behind a little bit, it operated this interesting liminal space of not knowing what was there and not knowing what's to come. And that's kind of what I tried to capture in this piece, that funny sensation when you pass by something, you know something has changed, you don't know what has changed, but you have this combined memory of, you have this combined feeling of memory, possibly a tinge of regret, and a sudden awareness of time and change, basically. And when I produced this body of work, it was sort of the research phase when I was in Saskatoon, and then the pandemic hit. And at that time, all the artists I know were sort of reevaluating what they were doing. How does it relate to what we're experiencing now? And so for a few reasons, I specifically chose to omit any text and language on these signs as well. Okay. So we're probably all familiar with the fact that, the past few years, a lot of local businesses have closed, didn't make it through the pandemic. I read this article from restaurants.com that, half of the Chinese restaurants in America have closed, for instance, which is a pretty stark number if we think about it. This piece was also a little bit inspired by that fact, the fact that we have to support local, the fact that we have to look more consciously around us and be aware of those things so that we don't miss them when they're disappearing and it's sort of too late in that moment. And it was also inspired by two funny stories that I heard about two different Canadian cities as well. One is Richmond in British Columbia, and then the second is Markham, which is in Ontario. In both of these cities, there's a big newcomer population of Chinese communities. And sometimes what you'll see in certain neighborhoods is signage that's only in Chinese, for instance. After this sort of took up a little bit, there was some reactions from a lot of the more English dominant speakers in the neighborhood where they were upset that they couldn't read this language. And it even got to the level of, city council meetings, public meetings, where people were quite adamant about the need to include English in these signs. I thought that was a really sort of interesting response because, so for myself, I can speak fluent Mandarin, but I have the level of reading Chinese as probably about a third or a fourth grader. And so for a lot of these signs, the linguistical content, so the meaning of the words, is not actually what I take away from it, but it's more the symbol of familiarity. So when I see these signs, it's less of oh, this place sells X and Y, I'm gonna go here, but it's more of a beacon of a safe space or a familiar space that I go to. So to hear kind of the opposite reaction where these signs were being perceived as hostile and uninviting is really kind of an interesting conversation of who is language for, who is it not for in that same respect. Also, being from a city as dense and as diverse as Toronto, we have so many different neighborhoods where you will see so many signs in different languages you don't understand. It's a little bit of a question of like, again, who is that for? Who's in on this? Who's being perceived as the dominant narrative that it's not for as well? This piece has been exhibited in a few different contexts, and the photo on the left is when it was shown at Toronto's Union Station, which is kind of our main train station, if you will, a really transitory space. So what we did here is the curator and I decided to put the signs really high up, almost like a weather vane to point north and south for directions for people, or east and south for people as they're, navigating where to catch their train and where to go. And then something Husha and I came up with here while we were installing the show at ICA is these cracks in the walls that you might see mounted to the mounts of the sculptures onto the wall. And this was a bit of a decision, kind of continuing on from the paint job from Means of Exchange, for instance, where we wanted to make the quite literal cracks in these forgotten places visible in a literal way. But I've been in the gallery for almost a month now, and in speaking to the public, it's been actually really nice because somebody told me it reminds them of overgrowing new growth vines or roots. And so to have that more sort of generative interpretation was actually really interesting to me as well. Okay. And so since I've been at ICA it'll be a month like tomorrow, I've been working on a new body of work called Grass is Greener on the Other Side, which is loosely based on the things available or unavailable at border cities, neighboring border cities specifically. And something you might see if you go up to the gallery is this small activity for what's on the top left here. And it's an invitation for the public to share their shopping lists with me, which I also welcome all of you to do if you're so inclined to. What people have been sharing has been really interesting because it tells actually so much about somebody without being asked to be hyper vulnerable, for instance. So what I wanted to hear from the people of San Diego is, where do they buy things? What do they buy? How is that a reflection of your lifestyle? How is that a reflection of your family? What you eat, what makes you comfortable, what you prioritize, and maybe other sort of cultures that you're affiliated or associated with as well. And if you go up there and you see some of them, there might be certain things you can discern about the writer of those shopping lists as a result of those small things that they include too. We so far, I think we have about 140, 150, both from the central location of ICA and the north location of ICA. And so I counted them all and I made this massive spreadsheet of what people are buying. And I highlighted the things that were sort of common things, but also things that I would likely buy as well. So, I'm gluten-free, so bread is not on here, for instance. And then what I've done is I've shopped for these things, both in San Diego and in Tijuana. And the idea is to show them next to each other. And if you go up to the museum, you'll kind of see this small shrine altar that's in a bit of a study for things available at both cities. Some of you might see that there's abalone on here, which is a bit of a weird one, and I'll talk about that in an instant, in a quick minute. But some of the sources of inspiration for this project were definitely the fact that, I grew up in a border city like Windsor and Detroit. So this project is actually starting from Windsor and Detroit and coming to San Diego and Tijuana to be extended. I'm really quite interested in how things you can buy here, things you can, consume, can actually be quite a reflection on that person and a reflection of that place. So local history is something I'm very interested in and something I don't think gets enough praise in the grand scheme of history. And so, for instance, from a few conversations I would have from folks who would visit the museum, I learned about this juice company that was founded by this man who, introduced Mexican flavored juices to the city, for instance, and how absolutely involved with being a community advocate he was just by running that kind of business, and also to the people in his business and being so supportive of that. So how, even though at face value he ran a juice company, how that stood for so much more. Or there's this other sort of entrepreneur who comes from a family that is a grocery store in Tijuana, and they made this hot sauce recipe. And then he, proudly stamps his hot sauce made in Tijuana and describes it as a sauce that's kind of like a portrait of Tijuana as well, because all the different peppers come from different parts of Mexico. And so you've got this sort of different grouping as well. That's a reflection of the makeup of that city. I included a component of abalone in both the Tijuana and San Diego side, and that was because of a funny discovery that I learned while I was here, where, in California, you hear a lot about the railroad and the gold rush Chinese migrants, for instance. Those were the industries that were really popular. But in San Diego, it was kind of unique, where abalone fishing was a big part of what helped a lot of early Chinese settlers get their start. Not only the actual fishing of the abalone, but also the shell. So that is such a site-specific, a city-specific, beautiful, interesting story that I felt really compelled to include in this display. And the gallery team was so kind to me the first week I was here, when I wouldn't just shut up about abalone as I was digesting this information. Now abalone is, from something that you probably all know, a protected species, and so you can't get it as frequently as it used to. I see some nods, yeah. And so the only thing I was able to buy while in San Diego was this brand called California Girl, and it's imitation abalone, which is large squid. Yeah, so that's the closest thing you can get now. And in that funny one jar, has all of that history for me of what used to be, what it supported, but also what it's not anymore at the same time. A big source of inspiration for this project that I realized over the holidays too was also, as some of you might be familiar with, when families would visit each other for the holidays, and then you would pack a suitcase, pack a care package bag to send back with your family member. I'm absolutely obsessed with these TikTok videos I've been seeing of international students who will go back to Asia, and their families will give them just a care package that's the size of a carry-on package of just, kimchi. And that'll be the only thing that's going back to them to another country, basically. This happens a lot during Chinese Lunar New Year as well, actually just Lunar New Year in general, where it's also not just, quote-unquote kids or teenagers or young adults who are receiving this, but this will also happen for adults who are in their 40s or 50s, their families will do this as well. So it's kind of an endless thing that's a really interesting way of expressing love, if you will. And partially, I was also very influenced by Filipino Balakbayan boxes, which in case you're familiar with the podcast 99% Invisible, there's a really good one that just came out this week. But these are basically huge boxes that migrant Filipino communities will pack with things from either North America, Europe, other countries that they go to, and then send this back to their loved ones back in the Philippines as well. And often these are sent almost as a substitute of when a person can't be present either. There's a really compelling, interview in that particular podcast where this woman's son is getting married or it's his birthday or something. And she packed this box with such care to send back to him. And she, as she's standing at the window watching the delivery man take it away. And you can tell that embedded in all of this is the fact that she can't be there. So this one box has to say all the things that she wants to say as well. So, I'm obsessed with groceries, and I think it's kind of a funny thing to develop a practice on now that I reflect on it. But at the same time, I'm very moved by how these actions around groceries and things that we find in the everyday can actually tell us so much more about ourselves. So hopefully that'll inspire you all a little bit to spend a little bit more time at your local grocer. But I'll end it here and maybe open it up to some questions before we jump into a conversation with Lei. Yeah.
Hey, please raise your hands if you have a question for Shellie. Ooh, I'll come to you. Coming.
Hi, Shellie. Thank you.
Hi.
We're so glad that you got this art in residence. So, from your first series, what do you do with the pieces after you photograph them?
That is such a good question, and I'm actually glad you asked. So I come from a family of hoarders, and I'm trying to be better at that, knowing the sort of ancestral pattern I've inherited, if you will. And so for a lot of those things, like kind of I mentioned, they're one-use things. You don't really have a home for them after, and they're things that break really easily too. So for a lot of the things in these photos, I tried to find second homes for them after they were shot so they don't stay with me, but also so that they can have another life and use. So the Christmas decorations I brought to my office. I work at an art school, and so we decorated things there, and they will be on constant display over time. And the balls I gave to my friends with dogs, and so distributed them kind of that way. The gift tassels, I use them for gifts and ask the people who I gave them to, when I can, if they could please reuse those as well in certain capacities. I kept the flowers because I do still like the flowers. And then the hardest part to find a new home for is the stuff branded with a Canadian flag because, part of me is thinking, oh, maybe I'll give them to some of my friends of mine who've just moved to Canada or recently they just started opening up the process where you can, finalize your citizenship again. So I thought, okay, maybe I'll give it to them after they've become a Canadian citizen, for instance. But I also don't want their first introduction to being a citizen of the country to be this kitschy thing and then perpetuate that cycle too. So unfortunately, that pile of stuff is still in my studio looking for a home. So if you have suggestions, please let me know.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, your talk, and was really touched about the interconnection between cultures. The fact that you're from a Chinese background and you've integrated what they're making there. I was moved at the end as well when you talked about sending packages, because this is the same thing. They're sending packages here from China. as my mother used to. My mother was German, and when anything came at Christmas, she lived in England for a long time, and the Christmas packages were like a lifeline. Everything in that package, the tissue paper it was wrapped in, the cake that, I mean, today you can't send these things, but then everything was in these packages. And it's very, very touching. I think there's something deeply, deeply connected to the individual. And there's something beautiful about this coming home. I don't know how else to put it, but you've touched upon it. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing that. It's also really lovely to hear how that sort of gift giving manifests in different ways. And usually this kind of gift giving, it's not based on a monetary, thing, right? It's not like, here's an iPhone, here's an iWatch or something like that. It's the subtleties that, conjure a memory or something. It's sometimes very embodied too. Like sometimes when I haven't been back to China in a few years, unfortunately, but every time I go back and I eat the vegetable there's something that's quite in your system that feels really sentimental. There's a funny article I just got a Google ping about right before this talk, and it was talking about how Filipino expats in the Middle East are taking suitcases of onions back to the Philippines with them because the price of onions there are high or something. So even things like that, that's quite logical, but is rooted in a thing of like, I'm going to buy them here to give to my family because they cost less here is kind of an act of love that I'm really moved by as well.
Hi, Shellie. Thank you very much for doing this talk. It struck me as funny when you talked about how weird it was to take pictures of groceries, but it just makes so much sense. It's our food. It's what sustains us. Like, have you had any interesting thoughts grocery shopping? Like, when you're in the grocery store just shopping, because you have your art process and then you have the task of buying your food. Are there any interesting thoughts that have come into your head at the grocery store, in the small grocery store in Chinatown, or, the large, big box store?
It's kind of funny because in Canada, for instance, we have a major grocery monopoly there. So we have like 2 telecommunications companies in Canada and then like 3 big grocery chains, which is really different from the variety you have here, for instance. Because I live in Toronto, we often have very walkable markets. So I'm very spoiled. I'll just go half a block up my street. I live in Toronto's East Chinatown, and then there's groceries there, for instance, and it's so easily done there. So I suppose some of the differences that emerge a little bit are the variety, for instance. Well, one big noticeable thing is when you go into a big box grocery stores, you have to walk down the ethnic food aisle to get your things. And then in other grocery stores, there's sometimes more nuance. It'll be, Indonesian foods, Filipino foods, Vietnamese foods. So I think it's the level of the detail of how they're cut, which also speaks to perhaps the quantity of different varieties that they have. That's been really interesting. I'm really lucky where, our fruit in Canada is not the best in the world. It's no California, for instance. But every time I go to the grocery store, sometimes I'll find new fruit that maybe that greengrocer is kind of testing out or experimenting with. So it's really exciting to be able to just try and learn things from shopping, but also eating. So something I will commit to is I'm going to eat this imitation abalone after I'm done with it and see what that tastes like, for instance. I don't know how I'll prepare it, but there is hopefully a commitment to eat all the things that I buy as well, as a different form of practice, maybe. Yeah.
Hi. My name is Danielle Zhang, so we share the same last name, Shellie. I'm here. Yeah, so I had quite a bit of conversation with her. It was so funny. World is so small. Apparently, my uncle and her grandma was teaching at the same very prestigious university in Beijing, China.
Isn't the world crazy?
I know, and I really have to comment. She has this amazing, think about it, you moved out of Beijing at age 4 to Baltimore. Your Chinese was impeccable. respectable, and I can imagine that's language is art too, right? So she said how she read ability versus the conversation. I would think she's just like born in China and lived her whole life there. Yeah, so I do have a question for you, but before that, I can give you advice how to eat the abalones. And actually, Chinese people love abalones, and it's a delicacy. And I know environmental protection is actually 8 inches. If you go diving, I actually did go to Northern California in San Francisco area to dive for abalones. And then you can only take so many pieces. If it's smaller than 8 inches, I believe, you have to put it back. And the production was amazing because it's a group of people, we all dive, got this one. And then you go home. My duty is to pound it with metal, like when you try to make German food, like to tenderize it, because it's really tough. You really have to tenderize it. And then you bite it with this spicy, like kind of crumbs. And then you fry it. It was delicious. Yeah, so my question is, what's you going to do when you compile this grocery list for cross-border, and where are you going to display it? And what's your coming project? It's going to be here in San Diego since you had your residency, or it's going to be back to Canada? And I also really appreciate your public artwork. I'm in transportation, that wayfinding to be embedded into modern arts, amazing.
Yeah. Thank you for all of that. And yeah, we definitely should talk, and I should get some recipes from you. With the abalone thing again, it was really interesting because I'm trying to find how to buy this in the city. It's not available. And the only places I would be able to find them were on websites like eBay, where you could get a can of abalone for like $400 US. Yeah. And so that's how sought out these were. And these are big ones. These are like meaty 12-inch giant pieces of abalone. For instance, that was, it speaks to the demand. And like you said, a lot of abalone that was fished in San Diego, from what I read, was exported to parts of Asia because it was so popular there as well. So it was very weird because there was a few eBay sellers where the abalone that was harvested in Mexico, canned in California, was exported to Singapore, and then I would try to buy it back from Singapore. And then at some point, I'm like, I'm not going to spend $300 on a can of abalone, and came to my senses, basically. But to your other question about this body of work is what you'll see up at ICA North right now is a study of how I've sort of laid things out. And on one side is all the things from Tijuana, and then on the other side is all the things from San Diego. And, go and look first to see if you can pick out which one is which city, just based on looking at the goods there. But they're kind of in mirror images of another, and that's a little bit what the visual is about. It's sort of like looking at a neighbor, looking in the mirror, seeing what commonalities you see in that reflection too. And then what I hope to do with that body of work later on, once I do the Windsor Detroit series too, is to make them in diptychs. So like one work will be a photographic pairing of both cities, for instance. No plans to show it yet. And then I would actually love to extend this research and work maybe at other residencies I do as well. Now that I've done 2 borders in North America, it would be actually really interesting to see how this project changes in border cities in Asia, border cities in Europe, or in other parts of the world as well.
I'm actually going to end it there. Thank you so much, Shellie, for this wonderful talk. We're going to take a 15-minute break, so please go grab another warm drink, huddle under the heaters for a little bit, and in 15 minutes we'll be back with the Art of Alarm performance. So we'll see you in 15 minutes, and stay warm.
Thank you, everyone.